Okay, for this part, we're gonna be looking at learning to think like a historian. How does a historian think? A historian is somebody who studies the past. This is what you're gonna be doing right now, and I feel like this is one of my favorite parts of this unit, is because this is where we're gonna be taking the steps towards learning how to be historians. You're gonna be doing that a lot in seventh grade and in eighth grade. So we study current events, what's going on around the world today. That's world cultures. This unit in particular will be giving us the baby steps towards being historians. Okay. Before we continue, I want you guys to go back to this document on your Do Now. Again, if you printed this out, you can write it down. Unfortunately, I just realized that you can't really type this because I managed to crop this out into this document right here, just to keep it intact and give it the format that I usually give it for you guys in school. So if you figured that, if you notice that, what I suggest is, again, just writing this down. Hopefully you already write down your causes and effects. I want you to answer the two questions right there. How does history affect us today? And how can history help us explain why things happen today? Okay, so take about 2 to 3 minutes for these two questions. Press pause and then press play when you're done. All right, so hopefully your answers should be something like this. If they're like something similar to what I said, just leave it like that. If it's not, or you're missing something, you can just add on or just fix it a little bit. So how does history affect us today? Anything that happened in the past has lingering effects or consequences to the current conditions that we're living in. So, for example, the reason why I speak Spanish is because I learned that from my parents. The reason why my parents learned Spanish is because I learned that from their parents. And if you go further back, you're gonna reach a point where it came to the point where the Spanish came and forced one of my ancestors to learn Spanish. That's an example. So history of the past affects us today, and that's in that sense. And for that example, how can history help us explain why things happen today? So as I mentioned, again, the example. So let's say, for example, today we have, if you go to every government facility or business, you'll find a mandated sign from the Civil Rights Act saying that nobody can be discriminated based on age, race, ethnicity, religion, and so on. The reason why, okay, this is because during the Civil Rights Movement, MLK helped to push that. Lyndon B. Johnson's the president at that time, he's gonna use this, realize that this is a very important, monumental right that everybody should have, and not something that should be enforced legally through all 50 states. So because of that, this is why we have those things. Okay. All right. So now the next part of your notes, if you printed them out or if you're gonna write this down, this is a graphic organizer. We're gonna be looking at two things, and I'm sure you guys have done this in Ms. Nakara's class already: primary and secondary sources. So just a refreshment, primary sources are events that are written down or documented by somebody who lived through the event. Secondary sources are things that are not written by somebody who lived through this event. Okay, so we're gonna go through some examples. So as we go through this lecture, when we get to primary sources, you're gonna write what is it, what are some examples, and why is it useful. Okay. All right. So who are historians and what do they do? Historians are scholars who spent their entire lives researching the past and forming opinions, that means interpretations about what happened. And again, history is never conclusive. It's not from point A to point B. It's always been, there's always conflict. Okay. Even in World War II, you might be saying that, oh yeah, Adolf Hitler started World War II, or he was the main cause of it. But others will say that it was not necessarily Adolf Hitler. They will say that it was the Japanese, the imperialistic government, who were trying to conquer all of the Eastern Asia. Okay. Some say that it's actually stemming from the Treaty of Versailles. This is the document that's signed in World War One. So you'll always have arguments from many historians. It's never conclusive. It's always up for interpretation. Number two, they have to use evidence. Okay, and I emphasize that evidence to support their interpretations. Then they write books explaining what they believe happened in history and why. Most historians work for universities and teach students about studying history, and some even wrote your textbook. Okay, so this is what historians are why they study history and who they are. in case you're interested. And I think that's a very important discipline that should be encouraged a lot in schools. All right. So there's a catch. So historians understand what happened in history? Well, yes and no. No one can know for certain what happened in the past. Historians must make their best guess of what happened. Okay. So again, this is all based on tools. And remember, this is going back to our do now. Is this a duck or a rabbit? Okay. If you're wondering what I saw, the first thing that I saw was a rabbit, but then I can see a duck. So it's the same thing with history. You look at a primary source. For example, Abraham Lincoln wrote the Emancipation Proclamation, and I'm going to read through that document and be like, okay, so I know that he wanted to free the slaves. But you'll have others saying that no, he only did that as a political move. Okay, it's the same thing with history. So you'll see things differently from others, and that's okay. So long as you use evidence to justify your arguments, that will be fine. How can we know the truth? Sometimes there's not one right answer or explanation. It is possible to see both a duck and a rabbit, depending on your perspective. In fact, two very smart people might disagree about what they see, and they could both be right. So how do we know the truth? Okay, so this is how historians study the past. Historians gather clues about history, just like a detective gathers clues about a mystery. For a historian, what is it? Primary sources are the clues they need to learn about the past. Okay, why is it useful? Primary sources help a historian figure out what happened, when it happened, why did it happen, and why is it important. Okay, this is going to be the trajectory for secondary sources, which we'll get to in a bit. All right, sometimes there's not one. Hold on, sorry about that. So I want you guys to write down this for your what is it on your notes. So what is it, primary and secondary source? I'll leave this here. Press pause and then press play. All right. So again, so a source created by someone who actually lived, okay, through the event. Okay. A secondary source is written by somebody who did not actually live through the event. It is often created long after the event. So we're going to see some examples in a bit. So here are your examples, and again, write this in your notes. Okay, what are some examples for primary, and then write for secondary. Okay, write what's in red. So primary sources are original material for an event in history. They are created by people who are directly involved in the event, depending on what they're studying. This includes eyewitness accounts, speeches, letters, diaries, newspapers, public recordings, works of art, photographs. So again, those are things that are tangible. That if you were to be like, okay, this very famous person made this source, okay, then that will be a primary source. If somebody's talking about that individual saying like, hey, that individual wrote that, okay, that's a secondary source. Okay, so let's go through this right now. Okay, for your secondary sources, your examples, write down what's in red in here. So these are created by people who look at primary sources and write their conclusions. They're written by people who are not connected to the event. Okay, we're going to be reading Who is Nelson Mandela, the book, really soon. This is a textbook that we had in our class. So again, these are people that simply were like, for example, World War II. Was I born during World War II? Maybe some of you think I was. I'm that old, but I'm not. Okay, so no, so I was not born during World War II. However, if I decided to look at World War II, all the primary sources, and write about World War II, a book about it, then that will be a secondary source. That's my source. This is what I think World War II was about, or why it happened, and so on. All right, so here are the good things and bad things about each of those types of sources. Okay, pros for primary sources: it gives us a first-hand look at what happened, allows us to draw our own conclusions. So we look at a primary source, and you can decide what you interpret about that. Okay, it might have bias. The person who made the document is going to have a certain bias. For a secondary source, this is an analysis. Somebody who analyzes the event or the primary source, they're going to write to their own conclusions. Okay, it has a bias as well, but it might not show the whole picture. It might show the distorted picture of what happened in the past. All right, so again, we already went through the examples for primary and secondary sources. So it's just an example that I made for you guys so you can see what I mean. So Mr. Castro writes letters to his friend in prison describing all that happened in the class today. 100 years from now, a historian finds Mr. Castro's letters and writes a book describing his friend's experience and as a prisoner and how he maintained his friendship with his friend despite being separated in a prison. Um, Long story short, I had a friend who vandalized a Picasso painting. I mean, I've completely disagree with his move, but we were writing letters to each other. I was trying to have an understanding of what happened, um, and with those letters, okay, do you think those will be what, primary or secondary sources? There should be primary sources, okay. Um, Even for example, okay, this is my wallet. Let's say, for example, there's hypothetically, I'm not saying that's going to happen, hypothetically, that there's a nuclear meltdown or something, or they're throwing nuclear bombs, okay, and 100 years later, they start excavating the ground, and then they find this wallet, okay, they're gonna find my driver license, they're gonna find my debit card. Can you make a story out of that? Can you find out something about the past? Yeah, and the answer should be yes. Okay, think about it. If you're born 100 years from now, and if you were to find things from the past from 100 years, you can have a sense about what people live by. Okay, just by simply their sources that they left behind. Okay, all right. So I'm gonna show you some documents, and you're gonna internally say if this primary or secondary. Primary or secondary. This is secondary. Is this a primary or secondary? The autobiography, this is the key word. Autobiography of Thomas Jefferson. And this is actually a primary because Thomas Jefferson wrote about his life. Okay? What about this? Social studies textbook, primary or secondary? This is a secondary source. Okay? Again, people that did not live through the events, but they're writing about it. Okay? Primary or secondary? This is a biography of Benjamin Franklin, written in 2007. This one is secondary. The biggest difference between this one, autobiography, is you wrote about your own life, and this one, somebody wrote about your life. Okay, so there's a historian who read through a lot of primary sources, reading all these documents, and this person decided to write a book saying, "Hey, this is who Benjamin Franklin was." Okay, so now I hope you're trying to see what the difference between those two sources are. Is this a primary or secondary? This is Anne Frank's diary. Okay, so this is of course, some of you already know. She was a Holocaust victim. She was writing a diary about her experience. This is a primary source, okay? What about this one? Newspaper article, 2008, Obama Makes History. This is a primary or secondary? This one is primary. This is when, from an event that actually happened. And this one's, okay, hold on, let's see. Okay, a letter, okay, from a soldier in the Roman Empire, primary or secondary? This should be primary. All right. Just for the sake of time, we're gonna move on. Actually, let's go through this one. So, analyzing evidence from sources, understanding bias. So, every source is primary or secondary has some bias, which means that it was created by a human being who had a specific reason for making that source and who had certain beliefs about the topic. For example, if Drake and Kanye are my favorite rappers and I read an article about them, okay, I'm going to be biased. This means that I will probably say very nice things about them because I enjoy their music. The things I say may or may not be true, but either way, I still have a bias towards enjoying their music, which you will probably notice when you read my article. Bias is a problem because it means that we can't fully trust everything as a source says. For example, in my Drake Kanye article, if I said that Drake and Kanye are the greatest duo rappers of all time, it will be hard to trust me since you know that I might be just saying that because I enjoy their music. Of course, I could be saying that because it's true. That's why you have to examine the evidence provided and decide whether what I'm saying is partly true or false based on the articles and the facts that you gather. So that's something to keep in mind. Again, like I said, history is very biased. It's not always conclusive, okay? It's something that we have to encounter. It's always important for you to be aware, and this is where it's gonna force you to have a lot of critical thinking. And this is why I love history so much, because it pushes you to really defend your views or your opinions on what you have about certain topics in history. Okay. All right. So this will conclude the segment for the lecture. I know I made a 2-part series. Please watch those two whenever you have a chance.